Hello and welcome back to the Holistically Well Podcast. I am joined by Cassandra Subler again, who is a women's health nurse and a nurse practitioner in training and also a certified FEM instructor. And today is all about ovulation and your menstrual cycle, specifically when breastfeeding postpartum. So this is a question anytime I do Q&A on my Instagram stories, I get asked about this so often. How do I track my cycle when I'm breastfeeding? How do I know if I'm fertile when my cycle hasn't come back yet? How do I naturally plan my spacing between pregnancies when I'm looking to do this from a cycle tracking standpoint, but I'm also breastfeeding and things are just not quite regular yet, right? So we will dive into all of that today. So it is for every woman navigating that blurry space between having a baby and figuring out what's happening with her cycle again, because the return of ovulation postpartum, especially when breastfeeding, is one of the most misunderstood parts of the female fertility journey. And that's probably why I get asked about it so much. So that is why Cassie is here. She is a phenomenal women's health educator and deeply understands our menstrual cycle. And so as you are learning today, know that if you have additional questions, she does support women one-on-one through this because sometimes it is a very individualized process, especially postpartum. All right, so first and foremost, Cassie, what should women be looking for when they are breastfeeding postpartum in terms of signs that their fertility has returned or is about to return?
So it's going to be the same as, if we're looking at our cycle in general. It's broken down into our pre-ovulatory phase, our ovulatory phase, and our post-ovulatory phase. So after you have a baby, you are entering into a undetermined time of a pre-ovulatory phase. So for some women, this can be a few months. For some women, this can be a couple years of that delay in that return of fertility. But what we're going to start to notice when that fertility is about to return is we're going to have an increase in cervical mucus. So the thing that can be hard is that this experience can be different for a lot of women. So some women will notice continuous mucus throughout the whole time that they're breastfeeding. So they might notice, a sensation of moisture or clear or stretchy mucus throughout, on and off throughout their postpartum journey. Doesn't always necessarily signal fertility until you're kind of getting more of a buildup of it. So it's when you have several days of this moisture leading up into clear, stretchy, slippery mucus that gets, almost like egg white sort of mucus. That's going to really be a trigger for that's showing you that your body is returning to fertility. A thing that can be really helpful, though, especially in the postpartum realm, is to have additional biomarkers to help track in order to help you to be confident of what you are observing with your body. Personally, what I've done, so I am currently 16 months postpartum, still waiting for my return of fertility. I'm still breastfeeding my son. But a thing that I have done throughout my postpartum journey has been to do the Marquette Method. So that utilizes a urine test that tests for LH and estrogen rise. So those are two important biomarkers. So your estrogen is going to slowly rise. And once the estrogen reaches a certain point, you're going to have a spike in LH, and that's going to cause ovulation. And ovulation is that key event of your cycle that allows you to conceive a baby. When you have intercourse, within like a 6-day window of ovulating, that's when you can conceive a baby. So really being able to pinpoint when ovulation is occurring is super important in that postpartum phase. Marquette helps you to do that through urine tests. It's not essential. If you have a pattern of dryness throughout your postpartum phase, you may have some days of moisture here and there as your body tries to have an increase in estrogen to try to, get that cycle up and starting again. You might notice that on and off. That's been a thing I've noticed. Might be a couple days that I notice the moisture, and then that goes away for another few weeks, and then another day, another few days of moisture. My body trying to start a cycle again. But if that's your experience, you could just rely on cervical mucus. But again, having a secondary biomarker such as doing urine tests with estrogen or LH, or incorporating some other, devices, some temperature devices, or like an Oura ring or something like that. There's lots of femtech devices that are coming into the world, which is super exciting. But it's always going to come down to what are our hormones doing, what are our estrogen and LH doing as far as noticing that return of fertility.
So with the urine test, is that something you're having to do daily or just before intimacy? How is that?
Okay, with Marquette, it is their protocol during the postpartum phase. It's called a 10-day protocol. So you do these urine tests for 10 days in a row, and then you have to reset they use a clear blue monitor. So you have to reset that monitor. So you take a day off, do an LH test, just a cheap LH test on that day to make sure that you didn't have a spike in LH, and then you continue testing. So that is the biggest downfall with the Marquette method as compared to just tracking your cervical mucus, is that these test strips run at about $1 a piece, which doesn't sound that bad until you're 16 months postpartum, and then you've been testing basically every day for the last year and a half. So really, when it comes to postpartum stuff, it really needs to be very individualized into, okay, how important is it for you to space your pregnancies? So, at this point, it's still important to us to continue to space pregnancies as I'm in graduate school. Again, if God has different plans, that's totally fine. But in those early postpartum days, I definitely find that if a woman is, experiencing, a lot of things postpartum that it really is very important to them that they do not get pregnant for several more months, the Marquette method can be super beneficial to have those objective biomarkers to know, okay, we are going to delay intimacy at this time because, we want to err on the side of caution when it comes to conceiving
Sure.
a baby.
Sure. So can you clarify, can you ovulate while still breastfeeding, even if your menstrual cycle has not yet returned?
Yes. So it can be different for different women. Some women, they'll have a bleed before they ovulate. Some women will ovulate before they bleed. So it'll be different for each woman, but know that you absolutely can and most likely will ovulate. So you will have an egg release from your ovary before you have your first period postpartum. Which makes it hard, again, because for some women it's a few months, which we'll talk about a little bit, some of the factors that can affect that. But for some women, it's their cycle returns 3 or 4 months postpartum. Some women, it's 2 years. So, but again, you can ovulate before you bleed. Typically, if you do bleed first, it's because it's a withdrawal bleed from your hormones shifting. So there's a couple different things that can happen, but yes, you absolutely can ovulate before you have your first cycle.
Yeah, and that is why, if somebody gets pregnant 4 months postpartum and it's a huge shock and a huge surprise, that's typically what has happened, is they happened to have intercourse timed with that ovulation, but they have not yet seen the return of their menstrual cycle, so they thought that they were infertile at that time. And so that is just important to note. Now, typically during that ovulation, that first ovulation, you should still see that increase in cervical mucus, correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So that can be what she was talking about earlier, of that fertility sign where it's going to be outside of what your norm has been postpartum, whether you have a little bit of mucus just consistently or you're pretty dry consistently. A lot of times we see patterns throughout that breastfeeding journey where it'll be a few days of mucus and then a few days of dry, and this is where charting comes into play, is where we'll start to see patterns unfold, and that can be just your typical postpartum pattern. But then when you see, to her point, of that buildup of cervical mucus, that is creating a greater ease for the sperm to swim through and fertilize an egg, and that's biologically why that happens. And so if you see that, know that can be a sign of fertility returning. Okay, so let's back up a minute to breastfeeding and that return of cycle. So some women think that you have to stop breastfeeding for your cycle to return. And for some women, that might be true. For other women, your cycle can return while you are breastfeeding. So just because you are breastfeeding, that does not mean that A, you are not fertile, and B, that your cycle is not going to return. So Cassie and I are perfect examples of being a little bit different in this realm. So we are both 16 months postpartum, which is too funny. We're both 16 months postpartum with little boys, right?
Yeah.
And my cycle returned at 7 months postpartum, while still breastfeeding. And yours?
And I'm still waiting. Yep.
Has not returned.
16 months postpartum. So.
Yes. And I am actually pregnant again. And I am still breastfeeding. Breastfeeding. Now, only in the evening at this point when I conceived. I was only nursing in the morning and the evening. He was 14 months whenever I conceived. I'm about 16 and a half months postpartum now. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so everybody's body is different, and some women will be trying to conceive while breastfeeding and unable to conceive because their fertility hasn't returned. So for some of us, the body does need that pause from breastfeeding to then conceive again. For others, we can do both simultaneously, and so it's just important to know that this is individualized for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it can be different for each postpartum journey as well. So my first postpartum journey, my cycle returned at 9 months postpartum. So that's kind of what I was expecting the second time around, but it really is kind of is really affected by what's going on in your life and how much time you're spending with your baby as well. So with my first pregnancy or my first postpartum experience, I was working 12-hour shifts as a labor and delivery nurse. So I was still breastfed up until I was 20 months postpartum with my first, but my cycle returned, I think, at 9 months because I was spending that much time, 12, 13, 14 hours away from my baby. I was still pumping, but pumping doesn't cause quite as much of a release of the same hormones as doing direct breastfeeding. So that can be a factor as well. If you're thinking, well, why is my cycle kind of doing what it's doing? That can be a factor as well.
What are other factors? You mentioned some other factors that might influence whether your cycle returns or not while you're breastfeeding.
Yeah, so biggest thing is how often you're feeding. So the background or the hormones that are in control of your breastfeeding basically are oxytocin and prolactin. So oxytocin is the hormone that is released as your baby suckles that causes that letdown or that release of milk. And then prolactin is the hormone that is then secreted once your breasts are emptied to tell your body, oh, my milk ducts are empty. I need to fill those back up to be able to make more milk for my baby. It's that prolactin that has the job of suppressing the return of your fertility. So that prolactin suppresses your FSH, which is your follicle stimulating hormone, which is kind of the hormone that kickstarts your cycle, also suppresses your estrogen. So your prolactin levels are really important for that. And it's important that they're consistently going up and down. So an important thing is that in order to delay the return of fertility is that you're exclusively breastfeeding. And again, this isn't for every woman because my baby is eating plenty of other things right now that aren't breast milk. But in those first few months postpartum, so if your baby is exclusively breastfeeding, so they don't have any pacifiers, they're not sucking on anything else except for your breast, and that's occurring about at least every 3 hours, night and day. So nonstop that you're having these, spikes in prolactin around the clock. That is a really important thing that helps to delay your return of fertility. So it's typically around that 6-month mark postpartum as we start to introduce solids, or when baby starts to sleep longer stretches through the night. So when baby starts to sleep 6 or 7 hours at a time and starts doing that consistently, that allows your body to have enough of a lull in that prolactin to kind of kickstart your cycle again. And if we think about this from a biological standpoint, throughout history, women didn't have pacifiers, women didn't have all these different technologies to help their babies sleep well. They typically, slept in the close vicinity of their baby and were nursing around the clock. And that helps to delay their return of fertility. So, yeah. But then other than that, sometimes there's not really a rhyme or reason to why one woman's biology is different than the other. I'm sure someday there'll probably be more research on exactly what sort of genes kind of make these things happen. But some women, they're gonna just have that return of fertility at 4, 5, or 6 months postpartum. And I have a really close friend who, she was only nursing, a couple times a day, but she was almost 2 years postpartum, and had to almost wean her son in order to conceive the next baby that she wanted to conceive. So
yeah, it's amazing how we are all so different and that our body biologically just supports this return of fertility versus delaying of, and it's in a way to best honor your needs in that life season too. Okay, so what recommendations do you have in terms of tracking your fertility? So let's get actionable tools here that somebody is postpartum, they're breastfeeding, whether their cycle has returned or not. What should they be doing?
I mean, I would say really important, again, to work with some sort of educator to help you, have a one-on-one, okay, what do your biomarkers look like? And then helping you to kind of make decisions from there. But again, what biomarkers are we looking at? We're going to be looking at your cervical mucus. So what does that even mean? I'm sure Kayla's talked about this. I've talked about this, like, tracking your cervical mucus. What does that even mean? Or what is like the very practical, what does this look like? So what it looks like is, if you start today is the day you're going to start tracking your fertility. You're going to start in the morning, and then, especially as you're first getting started, the recommendation is to use, toilet paper, kind of fold it up nicely, and then, wipe front to back, and then really looking for the sensation. First, you're going to try to notice, what is the sensation as I wipe, and try to, as I go over my perineum, which is that space between your vagina and your rectum. So as you go over that perineum, what is that sensation? Is it dry? Is it moist? Is it slippery? Does it just slide right past? Those are going to be the first things you're going to look at. That dryness is going to indicate more of that you are in an infertile stage, whereas that slippery sensation, lubricative sensation is more indicative of higher fertility. So first you're going to look at that sensation, and then you're going to take that toilet paper and you're going to look at it. And then you're going to look, okay, what's the color? Is this cervical mucus clear, or is it cloudy? Or is it yellow, or is it green? Is it some other sort of color? If it's green, definitely talk to a healthcare provider. It should not be green, but if it can be yellow, sticky, pasty, it can be a variety of different things. But look at it. What is the color of what it looks like? And then what you're going to do is you're going to take your fingers. This kind of seems gross at first, but once you do it enough, it just becomes routine. But you take that cervical mucus, and you want to see how stretchy is this cervical mucus. Is it, can I stretch it at all? Can I stretch it, up to like a couple inches? So the difference in that, so that if it's clear and it's stretchy and it was slippery, again, that is that mucus that is super indicative of high fertility. And then even before that, when it's just like a little bit clear and might not be as stretchy, still indicative of fertility. When we're looking at your cycle, and we're looking at, okay, well, when was my fertile window start, like when I'm looking at a cycle? So when you are charting from a FEM standpoint, so I'm a FEM trained educator, but when you're looking at your fertility, so any time when you, either while you're like walking around during your day, if you notice just a sensation of moisture at your vulva, so that you're walking around, you're like, wow, it's like, I feel really moist, then that's a indicator that you are in the beginnings of your fertile window. And then as you're observing throughout your day, once you start to notice, again, that sensation of moisture or any sort of clear mucus, that's going to be a red flag that, I'm entering into my fertile window. And again, it's going to start with a couple days of that moisture typically. Instead of going to quickly progress into more fertile mucus, so more of that clear, stretchy, slippery mucus.
Yeah, so if you are trying to conceive, that's your window, right? You start noticing that, like, okay, it's go time. And we have about a 5-day runway leading up to our ovulation where we are considered fertile, even though we haven't ovulated yet, because that sperm can live inside of us for 5 days, up to 6 maybe, even in some accounts. So then that day of ovulation, our egg only hangs around for 24 hours. So that is where we can get that 6th day sometimes, because if that sperm is still hanging out and then we've ovulated and they're there at the same time, we could get that fertilization. Or you, of course, could have intercourse on that day of ovulation, and you would conceive. You could conceive if the sperm chooses to fertilize that egg. But I think that's so important to recognize, because we think of ovulation is this main event, but really you can very much get pregnant if you have intercourse the 5 days leading up to that ovulation, because the sperm is still hanging around and living inside of you. And that is why with those different biomarkers, temperature, for instance, if you are trying to delay pregnancy, is not the best biomarker, because your temperature rises after you've ovulated. And so if you've had intercourse those 5 days leading up to ovulation and you're only looking at, my temperature's risen, I've ovulated, well, you've already had the intercourse and the sperm could be hanging out already for that fertilization of the egg. So it's one biomarker, but that is why the cervical mucus is so important, because it's showing you that runway up to the ovulation as the main event. And then we get kind of that drop off after in terms of our fertility 24 hours after that egg has been released. So if you're trying to achieve pregnancy, that is your key time. If you're trying to avoid pregnancy, you of course want to avoid intercourse. That 5 days ahead of ovulation, you see that temperature rise. And then the nice thing about the temperature rise, then that tells you, okay, now I have ovulated. Now we are good to have intercourse again, like the 24 hours after that temperature rise has occurred. Okay. So in terms of practically tracking this, I have tracked this in the Ovia app. I know using the Oura Ring, there's a cycle tracking app linked to that. They link to about 3 different companies, and that automatically takes the temperature that the Oura Ring tracks and drops it into that cycle tracking app. There's pen and paper that we can do this on that you can get from the FEM specific protocol. So any favorites that you want to share with our listeners, let's say your top 3 favorite ways to track your cervical mucus and any other biomarkers that would help indicate fertile time versus non-fertile time for whether we're achieving or avoiding pregnancy.
Yeah, so I would say, especially when you're first learning it, pen and paper can be annoying, but it can be super valuable to have that. And again, most of the different methods. So there's a variety of different methods. So there's FEM, there is Billings, there is couple to couple league, there's Creighton, and they're all going to have a little bit of a different chart. And you might find that one of these methods works really well for you, and you really vibe with the history of that method. So really don't feel like you have to stick with one. So really looking around and trying to determine what's best for you. But as far as practical things, so again, pen and paper for any sort of method you choose would be where I would recommend starting. And then also different apps. So FEM has an app. It's a free app. You can find it in the App Store, but also has a cool app that allows you to track those different biomarkers. So it gives you feedback based on what those biomarkers might mean, but it doesn't have a specific postpartum protocol in it. It's still the feedback it gives you is going to be relevant, but there's not I have to follow a specific protocol, and it's not going to give you that protocol within the app. You're going to have to work with a FEM instructor to be able to kind of see, okay, well, based on what my cycle looks like, what kind of days can I be utilizing? But that's really my biggest. I haven't done a whole lot of app charting. I've done mostly the FEM app and then pen and paper.
Okay. Ovia is another free app. It's OVIA, and that is what I use after being trained through the natural family planning method. That's another method that you can be trained through. And then I used the knowledge I got from NFP training to interpret what the Ovia app was telling me. And so I was just dropping that info in. Now, Cassie and I were talking ahead of this, is it usually takes an app 3 to 4 months, or an instructor, if you're working one-on-one together, 3 to 4 months to really learn and understand your cycle consistently, especially if you are postpartum and it takes a few cycles for things to start to regulate. So often your first 2 to 3 cycles postpartum, you might be a little bit longer, it might be a heavier bleed or a longer spacing or a lighter bleed. Our body's just figuring things out again. So just keeping that in mind when you are cycle charting, that it can take time for those patterns to fall into place. But also, and I say this just because it's front of mind for me, is if you are going to switch where you're tracking, keep tracking on the one that's been tried and true for you. So I had been tracking on Ovia for almost a decade. We were able to properly, I guess for lack of better words, space our pregnancies, our first 3 pregnancies, to where I wanted 18 months prior to conception of another child each time. And so I was able to wait that 18 months. It just was optimal time for my own healing and replenishment of nourishment and all of that. Felt like I had breastfed my current baby for the duration that I wanted to, and then I was ready to conceive again. So we planned that to a T, our first 3. With our 4th conception, I switched which app I was tracking on 1 month because my husband got me the Oura Ring, and I was like, I'll start using the app that links up with their temperature rise and all of this, and stopped tracking on Ovia, which had just gotten to know my cycle and very accurately predicted when my fertile window would be because of the 8 years of information that I had input into it. And so I didn't simultaneously track, and I conceived 3 days after switching over where I was tracking. And so if you're gonna switch, make sure you simultaneously track so that you can start to see if the new method you're using is lining up. And also, if it's not broken, don't change it. Would probably be the advice I would tell my past self. We are very excited about welcoming another baby, of course, but if you are family planning and that is front of mind for you, to her point, you know, in a stressful life season with graduate school and things like that, you know, if you're in a life season where you're like, I have a lot going on, I really need to plan for delaying another pregnancy, like just cover your bases, because that could happen. Surprise pregnancies absolutely happen, and they're a blessing, and God's plan is always greater than our own, but just something that from a personal standpoint I did want to mention as well. Okay, so for moms who are having a prolonged period of these irregular cycles, I mentioned how a few cycles postpartum, it can take time for things to re-regulate. But when should somebody reach out to a provider such as yourself to dig deeper if their cycles are not regulating postpartum?
Yeah, so what we're typically going to notice with our return of fertility postpartum is our body kind of has to go with like a mini puberty because we kind of suppress this. It's your hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis. Mm-hmm. We're going to abbreviate that to HPO axis because that's a lot easier to say. But your HPO axis, which is like the communication of your hormones between your brain and your ovaries, that just needs to wake up again postpartum. So what is typical to notice is that you will have a really short luteal phase throughout your postpartum return of fertility. Your luteal phase is your time after ovulation, so typically that's going to be short for those first couple cycles. Typically women are going to notice just shorter cycles in general. Not everybody, it's kind of a wild card, but that's typically what we're going to notice is that again, that HPO axis wakes back up. Give it 3 cycles to regulate. But if it's, if you have been cycling for 6 months postpartum and you're still having some really irregular, that your cycles are 60 days apart, or that you're having any weird bleeding, anything at that point, that would be a super important time to touch base with a fertility awareness educator like myself in order to start tracking those cycles a little bit deeper, in order to then get in touch with a holistically minded fertility care practitioner. So a nurse practitioner or a doctor or a midwife, somebody who's trained in these fertility awareness methods, to be able to deep dive into what is going on behind this. Is there something with nutrition we need to address? Mm-hmm. Because maybe, hey, you're still breastfeeding your baby, all day, every day, and you're not, you may not be nourishing your body as much as it needs to be nourished. So that might be something that needs to be addressed. Or maybe you have a thyroid issue postpartum, or some other hormonal issue going on. There's a whole variety of things. Or maybe you ended up with PCOS that you didn't know you have. There's a whole variety of things that could be occurring, and you're not going to know unless you start tracking these, tracking your biomarkers, and then getting in touch with a holistically minded healthcare practitioner who's going to help you find the root cause of this in order to, again, address the things, and looking into labs and, really knowing what's going on. So you're not just, just guessing and hoping like, oh, maybe if I wait another year or 2 years, because women can struggle with a thing called secondary infertility. They may have conceived their first baby just like that and not had any issues. But some women can struggle with secondary infertility. So don't feel like, well, I conceived my first baby, no problem. Like, I shouldn't be having issues. Like, no, if you're having concerns, you are validated in reaching out to a healthcare practitioner. And I would urge you to do it sooner rather than later, to give you time to be able to address issues. So you're not waiting until, waiting years and, wanting another baby and then waiting 3 or 4 years before you start, reach out for help. I would, urge you as soon as you notice these irregularities, to be able to reach out to a healthcare practitioner. Yeah,
because sometimes it can take time to get into somebody to get lab work ordered or a Dutch hormone test ordered. Like, those things take time. So if after 3 months you're not noticing it start to regulate, reach out, schedule that appointment. We'll get some blood work ordered, and then you have time to start to work through that. even before you're ready to try to conceive again, so that that's not a hindrance for you, because postpartum depletion is a real thing. And so a lot of times when we're seeing there's irregularities postpartum, or sometimes it even can be if the cycle is not returning postpartum, it can be because that body's just in a depleted state and it needs more micronutrients. And so I hope that today's conversation gave you more insight into that postpartum cycle and that breastfeeding cycle and ovulation and all of the things, because it is a time where it feels a little blurry and you have a lot of other things going on with a little newborn, right? But to understand, you can naturally plan the spacing of your family. And, you know, I have done that successfully between 3 of my kiddos, and the 4th, you know, it was a surprise. And to understand too that happens. And so to understand how that can happen, is an important piece of the conversation. Anything else that you want our listeners to know today, just in terms of breastfeeding, return of ovulation, and fertility postpartum?
I mean, just going off a little aside from, I've also, successfully spaced my children, but, what you're going to be offered in the hospital. I worked as a labor and delivery and postpartum nurse, but in the postpartum setting, there's some OBs and some midwives who don't have a thorough understanding of fertility awareness methods, and they are of the belief that if you don't use birth control, that you're going to come in, you're going to have a baby 9 months from now, that you're going to just not be able to understand your fertility. Definitely not true. It's important to be able to work with somebody who's able to help navigate this season with you and help, give you the personalized education you need to be able to track your fertility. But you can absolutely, space your pregnancies without utilizing birth control. I could talk for hours and hours about all the things that are wrong with birth control, or the issues that it can cause. But really, knowing that is, you're not crazy for not wanting to be on birth control. Even the midwives that I love to see in my last couple pregnancies, again, I would return from my postpartum visit and, like, oh, right, do you want any birth control? I'm like, no, and they're like, okay, you let us know if you do. And I won't be, but so really important knowing that when they come in and postpartum, they'll probably do it while you're in the hospital and ask if you want any birth control, just knowing that question is coming, and then, being able to say, oh, nope, I've done this training in, fertility awareness methods, and I'm not going to be utilizing this if that's the choice you decided to make. So
such an important point to bring it home, because she's so right. That's going to be like the first question that they ask. One of the first, what are your plans for birth control postpartum? And they'll offer you the different options, but very rarely do they offer NFP or natural family planning. And to Cassie's point, there's so many great options. And we've talked about many of the different methods today. There are a lot of these cycles, they all come back to cycle tracking though, right? And so you, as she said, can find what works best for you. Sometimes it's implementing multiple at the same time, and then you start to zero in on one approach because you find that your cycle speaks most to that, right? And its consistency in terms of being tracked. So if you are charting, or if you need more help charting and sorting through what the different cervical mucus markers mean, or other biomarkers mean, Cassie does do one-on-one consults with women to look at your chart, review it with you, and give specific recommendations. She'll also do some group training too.
Yeah. I guess one other just interesting thing, if you are planning to exclusively breastfeed, there is a thing called the lactation amenorrhea method. So you can definitely look into that. A quick Google search, or I can give Kayla something to put in the show notes. But there's some really good research. It's actually somewhere around 95% effective of using this lactational amenorrhea method for the first 6 months postpartum. So if you are new to cycle charting, you've learned a lot during your pregnancy, and you're like, I want to cycle chart, but I don't trust my body yet. Looking into that to know, okay, what kind of things can I utilize to really help, utilize breastfeeding and those things to be able to, slow down your return of fertility, to give you some time to start working through what are my biomarkers saying. So I wouldn't say rely on that and then forget about charting your cycle until the day of 6 months postpartum hits, and then you're trying to learn things. I would use that though to know that, okay, that if I follow these different steps, then these things are going to help delay my return of fertility. So
awesome.
Keep in mind.
Yeah. And Cassie and I did create a 90-minute workshop that deep dives into all of this further with additional visuals for you guys about cervical mucus and all of the things. So if that is something you are interested in diving into, you get lifetime access. It's virtual, it's video formatted. I will drop that in the show notes as well because we have that resource on hand for you. I'll also drop Cassie's information for any one-on-one support. And again, thank you for tuning in. This is an important conversation that a lot of women just feel unsupported in. And so that is why we created the workshop and why we sat down today to have this conversation with you. So please check the show notes for those additional resources. And we are excited to continue to support you in your women's health, postpartum, and beyond. So until next time, take care and be well.